This is a fantastic question. We couldn't do it. Both the par and the pack scores were all over the place. They're sort of like parceling out their soul, manipulate a ship. You can't turn your ship into a dog. That wouldn't make sense in the universe, right? It's not the property of the game. It's how people choose to play. Cool.
All right.
Should I introduce myself? Yes.
Yeah, sure.
So I am, as you know, Dr. Jaime Banks. I am an associate professor at Texas Tech, and that is in sort of a big city that's in the middle of nowhere in Texas, in West Texas. And I am in the College of Media and Communication, but I have kind of a crazy combination of interests where at the highest level, I study how humans have relationships with non-humans. And that has sort of taken two pathways, as I think you know, where it started out very much in a focus on avatars, which we'll talk a lot about today, right?
Yeah.
But then I also had this like life-changing experience with a robot, and then I started to go down that path as far as how humans connect with those types of social machines. I got my doctorate from Colorado State in Fort Collins, Colorado, and between there and here, I have worked at the University of Toronto and at West Virginia University. I also have many colleagues in Germany. That's me in a nutshell, at least the professional parts.
We also did like a background check about you, and we wrote like a small introduction, and you just named pretty much all the facts that we took down to introduce you. You pretty much just knocked it out of the park.
Shall we jump right in then?
Now that we finished the introduction, or you finished the introduction rather, because I don't have anything else to say, may we start with some warm-up questions. And
Sure.
The first question I have for you is, how did you come up with the idea of working on the subject of video games?
Ooh, so I originally in my doctoral program had started out looking at how people express identities in social media and online dating and other types of spaces where our bodies might be disconnected from the ways that we present ourselves, or where we can curate our representations, right? And when I started out on that path, my advisor at the time had been working on a project in Second Life. And then the second phase of that project was over in World of Warcraft. And I had really just kind of wanted to work with her on this project. And as I began to work with her in these spaces, I realized that there was a lot more interesting stuff going on in terms of identity when people have these whole bodies they can curate. And so I started moving more into the game space, and I was really not a gamer. So I was more interested in it from a scholarly perspective. And then I became more of a gamer later on when I realized that I needed to actually, more fully understand the thing that I was interested in investigating.
The next question would be, which fictional character would you most identify with?
Fictional character in any medium or in games?
Let's just focus on video games.
I probably most identify with my very first World of Warcraft character. She was a blood elf hunter. I kind of just started with hunter from the beginning and kept on going, but she had pigtails like this, and I had almost sort of modeled her on my younger self. Sort of, I've gotten cranky and serious in my older age, and so when I went into this game, I was like, I want to be maybe me, but still the fun version of me. But it had sort of not only the visual similarity to me, but also sort of like I would spend time with many of the things that I loved. And, as I mentioned with my three dogs here, I always play companion classes. And so it was nice. I would get a dog and my dog would run around with me. So it was kind of a very literal form of identification with that character.
Okay. That's really interesting that you still would most identify with the character that you created as the very first character.
Yes.
We also did prepare something to sum up the contents of the text. So there's like 5 core statements that we tried to come up with. So together with your colleague and also husband, as we found out, Niklas Bowman, you give the reader an overview on avatars in video games and the relationships players can have with them. And there are multiple psychological processes that can lead to player avatar identification, such as physical similarity, embodiment, value homophilia, perspective taking, wishful identification. But more on them individually later. And another way of distinguishing the player-avatar relationship is through the possibility of looking at the understanding of the player's understanding of their avatars. And these are defined by the archetypes avatar as object, avatar as me, avatar as symbiote, and avatar as other or social other. And for the future, you point out that new emerging technologies will define the way we relate to our avatars, especially with the possibility of persistent, automated, and intelligent avatars.
Good job.
Okay. The thing is, we are not experts on this field of research, so we mainly focus on your work in the Oxford Handbook of Entertainment Theory.
Well, and I'll tell you that this perspective is a bit different than much of what you will see in the broader literature. Going back to that initial idea, I had suggested that I didn't see a lot of stuff in the literature on what I had experienced. Much literature focuses on identification. It's sort of like the end game for player avatar relationships. I believe, so all of this work is grounded in sort of a difference between an operational sociality and a phenomenological or subjective sociality. I believe that operationally, with the way that things work between when you play a video game, you are giving information to your character through your inputs, right? And they are, in many cases at least, delivering information back to you. And then you may end up continuing a certain type of communication to it or trying to solve a problem a different way, right? To me, that is operationally social. And so all of this is built on the potential for all player avatar relationships to be experienced as social, but the way they experience it is different. And so while maybe we might even call it the dominant paradigm is still focused on identification, this framework is really focused on differentiation, the extent to which you have separated yourself from your character and see them as authentically sort of existing in the world and sort of engaging it as a companion in gameplay rather than any type of tool or extension.
Then our first interview question, which is one of my, I would say, favorite questions, because I just came up with it at some point while reading.
This was one of my favorite questions too.
Would you argue that the player identification in Red Dead Redemption 2 is higher in online mode than in offline mode, since you can, in online mode, create and customize the character, while in offline mode, you play a predefined character named Arthur Morgan?
So there is evidence in the literature to suggest that different types of, avatar body customization can promote higher levels of identification. But as we just talked about, right, value homophilia being perhaps the strongest influencer on identification. This is a fantastic question. I think it is still possible though, right? Because if in both modes, you can still make certain types of choices, right? So even in both, you can kind of set your character on a particular pathway. It's just that you are then adding the character customization option. I will tell you, there is a definite benefit for me. I always play female characters for whatever reason. If I have to play a male character, I don't feel very connected to it. So there could be, a definite benefit to online mode for me as a player, as far as being able to choose a female character. And that said, there's an interesting dynamic with Red Dead as well, because playing offline, you play the main male character. I got really wrapped up in that story. I really liked the character and his progression. It was awesome. So it could go any number of ways. And this really, I think, brings up an important point, that when we talk about identification, differentiation, and relationships more generally, while there can be contributors to that relationship from the game, a lot of what will influence the relationship is what the player brings into the game. right? Their preferences, their prior orientations, their gaming experience more broadly. A lot of this can influence how the relationship forms and how it progresses. We had actually tried to manipulate a player avatar relationship once for an experiment, trying to get people to identify and differentiate. We couldn't do it. We even tried some very overt types of cues, like, because we made this game and we made 2 versions of it. It was kind of more like a serious game to teach empathy. And in one version, we did it first person perspective, with a hand as the cursor and first person pronouns and all of this. And in the other version, we did more of like a third person camera. It was more like I think it was a cursor, and then we did third person. And those are pretty strong and obvious cues. Player avatar relationship, both the PAR and the PAX scores were all over the place. We could not actually manipulate this. And that really speaks to not only sort of what are people bringing into it as a big influence, but most of these, when we talk about PAR and PAX, we're talking about a connection that's been established and grown over time. So while we couldn't force them into it, it is still possible that certain types of features may, over time, help promote different types of connections.
Okay, that's really interesting. So you would argue that the type of player avatar relations people build are probably persistent for a person between different games?
Not necessarily, because even within a single game, let's just take WoW, since that's where most of my work has been. I have interviewed so many people who have different, multiple characters, and they have one kind of connection with their rating character and another type of connection with their achievement character. So I once heard a participant describe it as Horcruxes, from Harry Potter, that they're sort of like parceling out their soul to have these different types of connections with different characters. And we could still be predisposed to having a particular kind of connection. For instance, in that study where we had tried to manipulate PAR for the serious game, the thing that mattered most in how people oriented themselves toward their character was trait empathy. So the strongest thing was the personality trait that they brought into the interaction. So there still can be predisposal to a particular kind of connection, but there's also sort of the way you play it. So what I found in my original dissertation work was that there were some suggestions that the more your gameplay is like work, that is grinding, heavy rating, progression rating, right? That tended to move people more toward the asocial end of the spectrum, more like an object. It's a tool to play the game, right? But the more people wrapped a narrative around their character, the more social it became, right? And that makes sense as well. That is, if you assign it sort of its own motivations or relationships or goals, then it starts to seem more like a social other. It's not the property of the game, it's how people choose to play, because I was never a hardcore player, right? And so it didn't quite get there for me. But the patterns overall suggest the more you engage in that work-like gameplay, the more asocial your connection will become.
Okay, but then the possibilities a game offers can also be limiting to this, right? To the individual experience a player can have, because like in games like we have a question about League of Legends in our interview. In games like this, where the gameplay is very much limited to this 5 versus 5 arena game mode, you can't really have like a non-competitive gaming experience.
So there certainly can be influences and affordances for certain types of connections and constraints. In one data set we saw, we looked at genre differences. And what we didn't see actually a ton. There were lots of distributions of different PARs across all different genres. But what we did see, for instance, is that in sci-fi games, we saw a greater prevalence of avatar as object orientations. And really what we determined is that's not actually a function of the narrative. It was really the fact, we think, that most of the respondents in that group of games were playing EVE Online, where you don't often see your character, you manipulate a ship. Yeah. And so, less anthropomorphism, most likely, right? And you are sort of navigating this ship. And so maybe that leads you to see your character in a sense as more of an object, right? A tool to play the game with.
Because he is.
Right. And so certain types of, this goes back to your customization question, right? Certain types of abilities to manipulate or to craft a character, certain types of raw materials, right? The constraints for character customization. You can't turn your ship into a dog. That wouldn't make sense in the universe, right?
Yeah.
So that by design may limit your ability to connect with your character in certain ways.
Okay, so you also say that the possibilities the character creation tool or character customization tool offers can limit the amount of identification you can reach.
Sure, and it could even extend beyond that into the physics, the game world physics, right? Can you fly or not? I get irritated with some of my characters when I feel like they don't run fast enough, right? There could be the overarching narrative that will influence whether or how you connect, in terms of what decisions are you allowed to make and what decisions aren't you allowed to make. In our recent playthroughs of Cyberpunk, you choose a dialogue option, and we think that one choice makes sense for how we're playing the character, and then it says something that we don't feel matches that, and it's frustrating. And then we're like, no, but that's not what I meant, right? And that's not what I meant for my character as a persona.